I'm escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism. Space!
Hello everyone, ladies and gentlemen, kids of all ages. My name is Avi, and welcome back to episode 10, yay, of Gregtech New Horizons. Last time, we did some bits and bobs around the base, getting ourselves into bees and crops and a bunch of hoo-ha. But today, we are going to go to space. However, that might be getting a bit ahead of ourselves. You see, the road to space is long, and the start of that road to space is actually getting 6 wither skeleton skulls to kill 2 withers. And to get those wither skeleton skulls, I have this cleaver that I made off camera with beheading 5 on it, so 50% chance to behead. But those wither skeletons are more of a side project. The first goal to getting to space is actually to get toluene, of all things. To get toluene, I'm going to be distilling heavy oil. So the setup is actually fairly simple. In fact, it's the same as the setup that we have in our oil room. It's just now, instead of just turning the heavy oil into fuel, we're going to be distilling it to get its toluene. In terms of ways of getting toluene, this is probably the least efficient way. It wastes a ton of oil, and doing a bio route that uses something like wood tar would be far more efficient. It's just that I don't have the setup for wood tar, and for what I'm making here, I don't need a large supply of toluene, and I won't need industrial amounts of toluene for a while, so just buffering it up is more than good. Here we can see me turning the sulfuric heavy fuel into the regular heavy fuel, and there it is being distilled into the little bits of toluene we need. So I mentioned in the last episode that we actually made the sugar beet farm for a very specific reason, and that is true. Sugar is used to make a gelled toluene. So regular toluene isn't good enough for what we're looking for. We need to gel it using sugar and polyethylene. Now, as I kind of have realized at this point, I really did not need an industrial sugar setup like this, but I guess bigger's always better in Gregtech, so no harm, no foul. In lieu of this, I should probably explain what I'm going to be doing with toluene and sugar. I'm going to be making bombs. Well, sort of. We're going to be going on a bit of a wild goose chase in order to get all of the components to go to space. However, one of the things that we need is industrial TNT. Well, it's one of the things we can make at least. The Implosion compressor is required to make compressed plates for later Galacticraft stuff, and the Implosion compressor needs some amount of explosives to run. The best explosive for it is something we can already make in pretty large quantities now, and that would be the aforementioned industrial TNT. For it, we need toluene, sugar, to make gelled toluene, and then we need to mix the gelled toluene with nitration mixture in order to get the industrial TNT. What I've been doing for the past couple seconds is actually setting up the mixer that will make the nitration mixture for us, because all it takes is nitric acid and sulfuric acid. Nitric acid, we have obviously made the chemical reactor for cetane boosted diesel, and we've been getting a large amount of sulfuric acid as a byproduct of cetane boosted diesel. In terms of explosive sources, industrial TNT is literally the best one in the pack. There's regular TNT, there is dynamite, there's powder barrels, but all of them are honestly more expensive and less efficient. So industrial TNT is not only the best one in terms of just like literally the best one, it's also the best one economically, surprisingly, which is not the norm for Gregtech. This is a very lucky thing that has happened. That being said, the nitration mixture is done, and now all that's basically left is to just set it up. The reaction is sugar in tiny piles of polyethylene, which I'm going to supply manually into it, will then form gelled toluene, and then gelled toluene, 4 of it, with a bucket of nitric acid, a bucket of nitration mixture, will get the industrial TNT and produce some dilute sulfuric acid that I pump out from it as a byproduct. Meanwhile, while doing this, I actually make the implosion compressor because I haven't made the multi-block for it yet. The first bits of gelled toluene come in, and then we start making the actual industrial TNT after setting up all the nitration mixture routing. There's a bunch of pipes that are going all over the base at the moment, but there we have it. Industrial TNT pretty much automatically, which is very good because we are going to need not a lot of it for Galactic Craft, but we're going to need a stack or two of it. After covering everything up so that it actually looks pretty now, I look back at my to-do list. And it's a pretty short one, but it's a lot of important things. And we already got 1 out of the 4 of them done. So let's work on the second one. But first, let's appreciate the stack of industrial TNT we have. Don't place it down because you can't pick it up. Despite the next thing on my to-do list saying that I'm going to be making the implosion compressor, I actually start looking towards the NASA workbench right now. NASA Workbench itself isn't too expensive. However, it takes 9 Nether stars in order to make, which is an absolutely ludicrous amount under normal circumstances. Fortunately, we're playing Gregtech New Horizons, and normal circumstances are kind of thrown out of the window. We won't be talking about the circumstances just yet, but before we can really start our Nether star duplication intentional, not glitch, we have to kill 2 withers to start it. Now, so I spawned my first wither, and he kind of decides to just leave me. Not really sure what happened there, but he's gone. So, attempt number 2. Despite the fact that this pack has hardcore ender expansion, this pack does not have hardcore wither, and the wither goes down like a piece of cake. Surprisingly, a crossbow that does 65 damage and a sword that does about 30 is pretty good at taking down a mob with only 300 hit points. So he goes down without even a hassle and with just a bit of wither damage. The second one doesn't go down any harder. He dies immediately. It's an unfortunate fate for these withers. Honestly, thinking about it now, it might have just been easier to kill 9 withers, but instead we go for null catalyst duplication. However, more on that in a minute. The NASA Workbench is just a whole hubbub of crafting chains. One of the crafting chains is to get 2 mainframes. Our first IV tier circuits. Yes, we've been in HV, we've gone through EV. Well, we've gone through HV, we've been in EV, now we need IV. We can't use IV for a lot right now. In fact, we can only use IV circuits in order to make this NASA Workbench. But we need 2 of them anyways, and they take 2 EV circuits each, so it's a whole crafting chain, but it's not too bad, realistically speaking. Anyways, back up the list. Implosion compressor time. The implosion compressor is one of the simplest multi-blocks in the entirety of Gregtech. There's an input hatch, there's an output hatch, there's an energy hatch, there's a muffler hatch, and that's kind of all the interesting parts to it. It's more simple than even the electric blast furnaces, and about as simple as the vacuum freezer that we made last episode. So, yeah, it's not complicated. And the really cool part is that it can basically stay at MV power. I think I only need a higher tier implosion compressor much later on once I start getting to IV. So, this is a perfectly fine implosion compressor. And, as a bonus, all recipes only take 1 tick in it. To demonstrate this immense power of single-tick recipes, I make 1 compressed copper plate using a triple copper plate and industrial TNT to make it. Very simple, happens in literally 1/20th of a second. It is so good. This is true for every recipe in the implosion compressor as well. Alright, so null catalyst. Let's talk about that. So null catalyst is this thing that by itself can't really do anything. However, if you combine it with 16 Salus Mundus in an assembler, you will get 1 Nether star out of it. And all it takes is 1 tiny pile of Nether star dust in order to get it. So effectively, this allows us to duplicate Nether stars. At the price of a lot of Salus Mundus. Now, in order to help with this, I made some goggles of revealing because I'm going to need to make a ton of balance shards in order to macerate them all down in order to get all the Salus Mundus required. In terms of the stratagem for getting the Salus Mundus, it is 4 of each type of shard, 5 iron, and 5 of any type of the powders. And then you get a perfectly clean recipe that gets you 4 balanced shards each, and also 5 thaumium, which is actually a really good deal, because by the end of this, I had about 2.5 stacks of thaumium. So, while I did have to spend a lot of time sitting at this cauldron for God knows how long, the couple stacks of thaumium is not a bad thing to get, especially when it's clean as this. Once you get all the balanced shards, you just macerate it and you get the Salus Mundus. And then you combine that Salus Mundus with the Null Catalyst to get the Nether Stars. And ultimately it takes about 2.5 stacks of Salus Mundus in order to get all the Nether Stars that you need, which takes a while, but I do eventually end up getting it. And yeah, overall, I probably could have just killed 9 withers and it would have been fine, but I guess this is a fun side project. Plus, I wanted the goggles of revealing for a while now anyways, so I mostly just pushed it forward. Anyways, you compress those Nether Stars into a block of Nether Star, and then you cut it up into plates, because you actually only need 6 Nether Star plates in order to make the 3 multi-purpose robot arms for the NASA workbench. After making the mainframe and the multi-purpose robot arms, the rest of the microcrafting isn't hard at all, and we get the NASA workbench not long after. This thus makes us 3 out of 4 of the ways done to getting to the moon. Sort of. So, we have the Implosion compressor, we have Toluene, and we have the NASA workbench. However, the moon kind of thing, it kind of ignores the massive intermediate crafting operation to get all the stuff for the rocket. Though, now that we have the NASA workbench, we can actually start making pretty good progress towards that. Let's go to the moon soon. One of the first and easiest things I can make that's required for the moon is the oxygen mask. All it takes is a scuba helmet and then some reinforced glass lenses. So, very easy. One of the things. I also start working on making tier 1 rocket alloy ingots. This takes 3 bronze, 3 aluminum, and 3 steel each in order to make. This gets us the alloy kind of structure, and then we can end up putting that through an implosion compressor again to get the actually heavy-duty alloy. We're in Batch Craftomania, and I am making a prospector's scanner. This allows me to analyze the ore content and fluid content of the chunk. Very nice for Moon, where time is a bit of a limited factor, so being able to find ore veins quickly is important. I also start making the oxygen compressor, firstly for the oxygen gear. The oxygen gear actually allows the oxygen mask to work once we have oxygen tanks, which we don't, but now we have the stuff to actually start utilizing oxygen. The oxygen tanks themselves are actually really cheap to craft, just taking 7 compressed aluminum for each. I first make 2, but I end up making 2 more, just to be safe. I make an upgraded version of my backpack next. This is so that I can carry more stuff to the moon and more stuff back from the moon, because there's a lot of useful things on the moon that I'm going to need in bulk, and that tiny little backpack won't work for it. Here I'm grabbing a parachute that I made. A parachute is required so that I don't die falling back to the Earth from the moon, so also very useful to have, obviously. That was all boring utility stuff. Here's my first machine, the oxygen collector. This will collect oxygen from leaves and thus can be used to put them into an oxygen tank later. Now I have all of those tier 1 rocket alloys, so now I'm turning all 37 of them into heavy-duty plates. But because I'm a troglodyte, I don't actually look at the implosion compressor running and instead stare at this quest. It takes 2 industrial TNT for each, which is, I guess, more expensive, but not by a lot, so who cares? The 37 are all finished, and that's all we end up needing for the rockets. That's good. So, in order to get oxygen, we need to fill oxygen tanks. And in order to fill oxygen tanks, we need to do a specific setup with oxygen collection and then oxygen funneling. It's a really boring and annoying process. But all that we need, basically, is just a room filled with trees, and in this case, artificial trees. And then the oxygen collector will take some oxygen from those things and then push them straight into these oxygen tanks that we're going to have. It is really simple to set up, and it takes me all the matter of maybe like 30 minutes. And there we go. It is done. The little kind of oxygen room. Of course, both the oxygen collector and the oxygen setup are useless without the oxygen compressor, which allows me to put that oxygen into oxygen tanks. So there we go. And I have a little bit of trouble setting it up because they only take RF to run, but eventually I get it to work. So that's good. It's filling up those oxygen tanks. That's all working like a charm. I know I'm going rather fast through this, but that's because all of these subcomponents are just so irrelevant to the whole thing. Like, here I'm making a rocket control unit. This is literally just used to make this first rocket. There's nothing else it's used for. So, it's only used in this one specific circumstance. So, yeah. And here I'm making 2 frequency modules. One of them is for the moon lander and whatever. There's just a bunch of nonsense you have to make to go to the moon. Like these small fuel canisters, also for the rocket. And the nose cone for the rocket. We've started moving past things for myself and moving towards things for the rocket, which is a little bit of progress. Here I am making the 4 rocket fins that are required for the rocket. And that sets up most of the things for the rocket, but we still got quite a few more. Here I need to make a fuel loader, which will fill the rocket with fuel. Remember, cetane boosted diesel is a perfectly functional rocket fuel for both tier 1 and tier 2 rockets, so we are capiche there. Here I'm making the seat for the lander, which fortunately we don't have to make the buggy for anything, but we do need the seat for the lander, if that alone. And after this, I'm making the 2 tier 1 rocket engines that you need. One for the lander, one for the rocket itself. And after all of that whole bunch of microcrafting, we still gotta make one more thing. We gotta make the lander. But after we make the lander, which isn't even that much more expensive after all those subcomponents, we finally have the stuff to make the rocket. That whole microcrafting section that we sped through in about 2 minutes, that took about 3 hours for me, so you should be glad that you didn't get to see it all. But with all this stuff, and it's quite a lot of stuff, that forms the first rocket, period. It's big, it's large, that's just it. It is the first thing that we get. It is a real big sign of progression. We don't launch it quite yet, but it just, even just holding it, it looks monstrous. And it really symbolizes kind of how far we've come. But we have further to go still. We are not done. We're going to ignore rockets for a moment because this is a really tiny ruby juice setup. All it does is it turns ruby ore, sodium hydroxide, and hydrochloric acid into ruby juice, and then centrifuges that out. This gets us a really high amount of chrome, and actually, more importantly right now, aluminum hydroxide, which we will be using later. But the amount of chrome that we get from it is much better than just processing ruby regularly, so that's the reason why we want to use it. I also start laying out a third kind of negative first floor. I lay out a floor above the main factory floor. It takes a while, but it's actually smaller than the previous floors because I'm going to later have this be the AE2 cube room. So I don't really need it to be that big, and yeah, I don't want to bore you with all the montage of just me making the whole place because you can see the scaffolding. It's absolute hell. So there it is. It's a new room. It's pretty small, but it doesn't need to be that big. And more importantly, it's where eventually the rocket silo is going to go after just a little bit more working around. After finishing up the floor, then you finish up the walls, and the whole thing kind of resembles all the other points of the base, but it's just another floor to it. Very simple, pretty well lit, nice. I also make a HV miner. This is something that I'm going to use on the moon eventually. I want it to get small ores, because there's a specific small ore on the moon that we're going to need later on, but that's for later. Anyways, now I'm starting to make the actual rocket silo where we're going to launch the rocket from. To make it a little aesthetically pleasing, I decide to add some advanced drawbridges to it so that it actually ends up functioning like a rocket silo, where I can pull and retract the silo opening, which was a very fun little thing to make. Anyways, now here I'm making the big chute out of the mountain that this thing creates. And, oh lord, I didn't realize how big the mountain was until I started digging this thing. This is about 40 blocks deep, but, well, it doesn't look half bad once it's all finished. The whole silo room and silo in general is kind of tiny and not really worth talking about or even showing that much. It's just a hole, and the drawbridges are really the only thing interesting about it that I spend probably way too long trying to set up the wiring for, but it's not something that really I needed to do, but I wanted something fun, and I also wanted something that didn't have mobs start dropping on me at random, so that was also part of the reason I wanted the silo. And as you can see, though I don't know how well you can see because it's nighttime, it retracts and it extends. So, yeah. I put finishing touches on the floor and walls of the whole thing, so now we can set up our rocket launch pads, which I didn't show how to craft, but are ridiculously easy to, so there's no need to show. And the rocket goes on it. Looks pretty snazzy even just looking at it now. I'm pretty much finished at this point with all of the preparations that I have to make, so it's kind of just fill it with fuel and then set off for the races. After all this time, after what has been now about 200 hours, it's done. We have the rocket, and we're able to go to the moon. I've been talking pretty wordily for the past 20 minutes, so I'm just gonna leave the rocket launch to speak for itself. As I land onto the moon for the first time and start getting my bearings straight, I'd like to give some thanks to some of the GTNH people in the community who have helped me get to this point. I have been playing Gregtech New Horizons on and off for the better part of 6 years, and this is easily the furthest I've made it in the pack. I want to give thanks to Stu42, Minecraft YouTuber who has become inactive in the past few years, but whose GTNH series was the first one that introduced me to the entire mod pack. It's 6 years old, it's highly outdated, but I'd still recommend you to at least check it out, even if he doesn't upload it all anymore. I'd also like to give thanks to Nyagi Neko, who's now a streamer, but used to play GTNH a lot with me on the Delta official server. She was a great friend. She was also the person who made me want to start studying organic chemistry, which I am now currently majoring in. So, thanks to her. She's working on her own mod pack, and she has her own streams. So, I do recommend you to check her out. A link will be in the description below. Also want to give thanks to NeuroticGoose, whose GTNH Garden of Grind series, I believe, has inspired dozens, maybe hundreds of people to resume their Gregtech New Horizons Let's Plays. Sort of including me, but not entirely, because there is so much else that went into me deciding to actually do this and commit to it as well. Also, some thanks to the OG, Mr. Karox82, who has done now 3 Gregtech New Horizons series in survival. Possibly the most famous Gregtech New Horizons YouTuber, and I think it's well deserved. He's very nice, and I remember one time back in 2020, I streamed my Gregtech New Horizons server, my Gregtech New Horizons world at the time, in his tiny little Discord server, which I'm sure he doesn't remember, but I think back on it a little bit fondly these days. Hope your computer gets well soon. I also want to give thanks to NepJr, who has been one of my friends on the Toho side of things, who has also been deeply into Gregtech New Horizons like myself. And she is starting her own Gregtech New Horizons series fairly soon here, so I will put both her channel and the episode when it comes out in the description below. Hope you enjoy that. And, of course, just a general thank you to everyone who has watched and supported these videos, and even those who don't watch and support these videos and just follow me on Twitter and have no idea what the hell is with Gregtech, because a lot of you still mean so much to me. Some names that I couldn't mention here are Gorb, Issy, Nex, just so many people. Sentimentalities and John Maddens aside, let's get to digging. So, why are we on the moon? Why have we spent hours getting the stuff to go to the moon? The reason why is because the next voltage tier, EV or extreme voltage, takes titanium. The only source of titanium comes from the moon. Well, the only source of titanium are various ores from the moon, that is. Bauxite and ilmenite, mainly. So, in order to get anywhere into EV, we have to go to the moon. Unless we want to deal with bee breeding, which we absolutely do not want to do, because I am god-awful at it. The moon has a couple of other nice things as well, and by a couple of other nice things, I mean a couple of other things we need for EV. Anyways, right now I'm mining out a bauxite vein here for the large amounts of bauxite. Ilmenite is pretty good because once we hit EV, we can actually process it into some pretty good byproducts, as well as a decent amount of titanium. And there's another ore vein on here that contains monazite and neodymium. Neodymium is something that we need for EV electric motors, and also for SMD inductors, so SMD coils. So overall, there's a lot of really good things on the moon, and we're gonna need it to move just an inch further into EV, which is obviously where we're going. We are going to be jumping our way out of HV and moving into EV. Right now here I am switching from that bauxite vein to that monazite vein. Monazite is actually pretty good now that I realize, because it has a high amount of phosphate in it, which means that phosphorus doped wafers can be made really easily. We're running low on air, and we're kind of done with all the mining we gotta do here, so let's just head back off of the moon and go back to Earth. By the way, throughout this time, I have been just placing down lamps all over the place so that it's not flooded with monsters. And I made that tiny little moon base, mostly just for fun, but also because I wanted to make John Madden jokes. Goodbye, moon. We will see you plenty later. I will also leave the leaving sequence to your viewing pleasure. By this point, I was pretty much done with everything that I already had planned. I went to the moon, I got my bauxite. I'm happy, but I'm not happy because we want titanium. But not only do we want titanium, we want titanium good. So that is what our next moves are. We are going to get bauxite processing, and we are going to get rutile processing in a way that is streamlined and daisy-chained. See, bauxite contains titanium, but is only in trace amounts. So we could just process it through our regular super ore processing setup, and that would be fine, but it would give us a very small amount of titanium, and while we could probably work with that for the start of EV, it would not work to later EV when we need tons of stacks of titanium. So the solution is skip the small stuff and go straight to the big stuff. And the big stuff in this case is bauxite slurry. Bauxite slurry is a specific type of way of processing bauxite that ends up producing more rutile than it would otherwise. In this case, for every one ore, you get one rutile dust. And when you need 3 rutile dust for 1 titanium ingot, that's actually really good in terms of the ratios. It allows us to get a ton of rutile from a relatively moderate amount of bauxite ore. The issue is that it's definitely one of the more complicated processing lines that we've set up. The good part is that it is going to produce us a ton of tertiary metals, including gallium, antimony, and copper. What I've been doing for the past whatever amount of time is I've been setting up the early parts of it. And this is to say I've been setting up the thing that makes the bauxite slurry, the fluid heater which heats up the bauxite slurry into heated bauxite slurry, and then the chemical reactor which will turn heated bauxite slurry and 1 aluminum hydroxide, hello Ruby juice setup, into a ton of different things. Honestly, I can't remember all that was. I think it's 80 alumina dust, 16 bauxite slag dust, and just a bunch of other miscellaneous subcomponents. As we start getting further into the game, the ore processing lines for specific ores become much more complex than anything we were dealing with before. Some ores become almost impossible to get unless you do these kinds of very complex processing lines. In fact, the first one that we get is in the next tier, in which case indium can be gotten through any raw ores, and can only be gotten through a processing line somewhat like this. But for right now, we're doing this because this is, by and large, much more efficient. Here we can see it do its first run. It takes 32 crushed bauxite, or 32 washed bauxite, in order to make 8 buckets of the bauxite slurry, which will then all be heated up in order to do the heated bauxite slurry, which is then required for the chemical reactor. So this is effectively, because each recipe in the chemical reactor takes 8 buckets of heated bauxite slurry, it's 32 bauxite, like crushed bauxite, ore in order to get 1 craft of the stuff. I won't get too deep into the weeds of the wiring and all the stuff that I had to do in order to reprocess it all, but just so that you know, in order to make the bauxite slurry, you also need quicklime and sodium hydroxide. I will be manually providing the sodium hydroxide. However, the quicklime can be perfectly recycled. Also, for the chemical reactor to run, it takes 5 buckets of carbon dioxide. I had found a way to recycle 85% of the carbon dioxide that is used in a recipe, therefore making it so that I only have to add a tiny amount of carbon dioxide in order to get the thing running for a while. This is actually pretty similar to the polydimethyl siloxane setup that we have, where it recycles 75% of the chlorine. Therefore, we only need to input chlorine for 1 every 4 recipes we need to make. Here's our first run of the chemical reactor, and we can see that it outputs all the stuff that we need. It outputs a ton of alumina, it outputs some bauxite slag, and it outputs some sodium carbonate, calcite, and also sluice juice. Sluice juice we can just immediately centrifuge into a couple of kind of miscellaneous components. Things like iron, antimony, copper. Not terribly useful, but somewhat useful. So it's some nice extra bonus materials, but the real thing we're after is the bauxite slag. The back chemical reactors and electrolyzers will process the sodium carbonate and the calcite dust, getting us the quicklime back and also getting us some extra sodium and some more stuff to make carbon dioxide with. The bauxite slag is the very important part that will actually centrifuge into all the rutile and gallium we end up using. And here it is finished and with all of it working. I don't have anything too interesting to say about this anymore because I've kind of explained everything that there needs to be said. All of the item routing and that hoo-ha, that's just stuff on my end that I end up having to sort out over the course of 10 or 15 minutes. But the bulk of it is kind of already explained. You're going to be getting bauxite slag and you can reprocess the quicklime, but it requires a manual input of some carbon dioxide and all of the sodium hydroxide. So nothing too special, but also it's not that bad. I set up the final bit, which is the centrifuging of the bauxite slag, giving us all the useful materials we need. This thing is being powered off of only 2 HVE combustion engines, so it might run out of power if I'm running it really vigorously, but it should be fine for the large part. And there we go. We can see that it is producing all the things we need. Rutile, gallium, quicklime, silicon dioxide, and iron. Eventually, we're going to end up putting all of that stuff into just a bunch of storage drawers. I try to find a texture that looks fancy and won't look too bad on the drawers, and I come up with something that I sort of like. They unfortunately don't have framed drawer controllers in this pack. I also end up changing my drawer setup around off camera after this because I didn't like how this ended up looking, but it's the same thing. There's 12 dusts that end up being made here, so there's 12 dusts that end up getting stored in the drawer network. All of it is just going to all the right places. Send up the insert line finally, and it's pretty much done. Long as I throw in all the requisite necessities for it to run, it will run, and it will turn bauxite into a ton of things. Some quicklime, some silicon dioxide, a bunch of aluminum, and, of course, most importantly, the rutile, which is the only source of titanium at the moment. And I think the only source of titanium in the game, period. The next quest, the last bit of quest in HV, wants me to turn 48 rutile into 16 titanium ingots. So therefore, let's start the manual crafting change for our first bit of titanium. After covering up all the walls, of course. Don't want it to look too ugly after all. We got a factory to maintain. The first step in the process is making titanium tetrachloride. This takes 3 rutile, 2 carbon, and 4 chlorine for each bit of titanium tetrachloride. So we end up making 16 out of 48 rutile. You can see that it's pretty expensive. And then the titanium tetrachloride is then put through a blast furnace with some magnesium to form the hot titanium ingots and some magnesium chloride as a byproduct. So looking at this recipe, it's honestly not that bad. It's a fairly short processing line. It looks like a processing line we can automate. But I can't get too giddy right now. I mean, well, I'm going to be getting pretty giddy enough. We're going to be making our first bits of titanium by cooling it through the vacuum freezer. And then there we are. 16 shiny purple titanium. The first bits of EV. Look at that. And, of course, with titanium being gotten, it unlocks the EV chapter for us, which is pretty big. There is a lot of stuff in EV that we can't even sniff at, but we're going to have to start thinking about it. The first thing I make with titanium is a jetpack that I forget about until the end of the episode, so yay. It only takes 2 titanium, so it's actually pretty good use of it, but yeah. Funny little jetpack. We're actually probably going to use it. Anyways, remember what I said about us maybe being able to automate the titanium line? Well, it's time to start thinking about that in bigger terms. Turning the titanium into titanium tetrachloride and then smelting that manually is a very slow process. Well, it's not even that it's slow. It's that it takes up too much of my time personally. And also requires me handling a lot of chlorine at once, and that's kind of a problem. So, what if instead we just made a setup that would do it for us? Well, it's hard to convey processing lines through video. The whole setup cycles through all of the ingredients. There is nothing that gets consumed at any point during the setup except for titanium, and it even produces oxygen as well, which I can very simply vent. I decided to make an LCR to make the titanium tetrachloride, mostly because I don't have to make carbon cells in order to get carbon monoxide out of it. So it doesn't end up consuming the carbon, and it also gets me some extra oxygen, which is kind of nice, I guess. Plus, LCRs are something I'm going to end up making a bajillion of sooner rather than later, so I might as well get comfortable with them now instead of when it's too far down the line. However, the process that we're doing here is basically just the same one that we did on a small scale last time, except now we're doing it on a bigger scale. We're using a chemical reactor, turning a rutile and titanium tetrachloride, and then putting that through a blast furnace. Except now I make a dedicated blast furnace, a dedicated nichrome one at that. Now that we have nichrome coils and 2 nichrome coil blast furnaces, making more nichrome coils is just as easy as making the stuff and running them through. The thing is that makes blast furnaces tricky is that they don't have a lot of spots that you can put stuff on. You can only put stuff on the bottom layer, except for the muffler hatch, which what the hell are we going to get out of using that? So it becomes pretty difficult to do item routing and also fluid routing and also energy routing on one of these multi-blocks when there's just not a lot of space on them. Originally, I decided to go for an EV tier blast furnace. That is to say, it'll be running on 4 amps of HV power, so therefore it's going to overclock. I end up retracting on that because that ends up consuming far more energy than would be advisable. So I just retract it and just go back to an HV one. Because titanium tetrachloride is actually an HV recipe. So it's totally fine that it's working in HV one. It just goes twice as slow, which doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things because it's going to be running all the time anyway. Or it's going to be running whenever I want it to. Additional notes about the setup that might be weird to some people, I decided to not automatically cool down the titanium ingots. There's really no reason why I don't do that, and off camera, I actually end up adding the vacuum freezer to it anyway. It's not anything interesting, don't worry about it. So, yeah, I really don't know why I didn't decide to include the vacuum freezer in the whole thing, but, well, I didn't at the time, and I guess maybe that's just because it was easy enough without it, and I didn't want to extend it too long. But there we go. We can see that it's running for the first time. And we also have the carbon monoxide that will then be electrolyzed into the carbon and oxygen. I then shove magnesium into the blast furnace, and it starts making the hot titanium out of it. Just right like that. The magnesium chloride will then need to be oxidized into magnesium and then salt, and then the salt needs to be electrolyzed to get the sodium and the chlorine back. The chlorine that I funnel back into the chemical reactor and the sodium that I funnel into the other chemical reactor for the magnesium. It's a whole process, and again, the wiring is just kind of nonsense that you don't have to deal with because it's stuff that I have to deal with. But yeah, to suffice it to say that this is slightly annoying, but setting up this infrastructure early on is better than setting it up later, that's for sure. I also have 2 electrolyzers for electrolyzing the salt, which I don't really technically need, but I decide on having 2 MV electrolyzers for it because, I don't know, it just kind of looks funnier that way. I don't have any specific reason for it. I'm not a genius. I use pressurized fluid conduits to move the chlorine from the electrolyzers to the chemical reactor at this time. I was originally using regular fluid conduits, but those fluid conduits kind of don't work super well, especially when I'm dealing with fluids that I want exact numbers of. These pressurized ones aren't even that much more difficult to craft. I just was too short. And then I had enough, and it will now extract and pull them all immediately. Ender fluid conduits are actually really, really good in this pack because they teleport the fluids, but that's a thing for just a little bit later. And on that note, with the chlorine setup and the magnesium reprocessing setup, it's pretty much finished. If I throw rutile in there, it's going to just cycle that through and get me hot titanium out. There's nothing else to it. It will get me some extra oxygen as well, which I can fortunately use to make more carbon dioxide, but that's kinda it. All that's left is really to pretty it up. But yeah, it's on, it will work. And it actually ends up using energy right now, which is why I end up switching it down to HV power, but after prettying it up, it's done. We have something that turns rutile into the titanium we need. So, to put this in perspective, we now have something that turns bauxite ore into bauxite slag, which is the most efficient way of getting a rutile out of bauxite. And then we have something that turns that rutile straight into the titanium we want. And I also start messing around with the jetpack that I forgot about until now. And, I mean, we have a full stack of titanium just coming through like that, and we're only going to be getting more. Nowadays, stainless steel is very, very, very easy to get a lot of. In fact, I regularly make 9 stacks of it at a time, but titanium is going to very quickly become like how stainless steel is now. All it takes is 3 rutile for 1 titanium ingot, and we have a good source of both rutile and a good way of processing it. So that is very nice. Of course, I can't leave it hanging like that. Obviously, with titanium, what is the first thing that you're gonna need to make with titanium? That would be the EV machine casings. So therefore, that's what I'm making here. The next tier of machinery is upon us. After 6 years of playing this pack, we are in EV tier. The 4th major voltage tier. We've made it. We have so many things that have opened up to us. And as I finesse around with the jetpack, that is where we are going to have to end things off here. EV is one of the most important voltage tiers. I know I said that right after HV, but I mean it for EV. There's multi-block after multi-block after multi-block that are so important to get, so important to keep, and there is so many things that we can do with titanium right now. I am very excited to be deep into the Gregtech world now. Obviously, there's still a lot that we have to do, still a lot of loose ends to tie up, but all of that, all the things that I'm going to be seeing for the first time are going to be things that I'm going to be saving for next time.